Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing week 25 of my 2020 reads. This week I finished 2 books and I also paused 1 book. The first book that I finished this week was White Rage by Carol Anderson. This was one of the 2 books that was chosen for the Blackout Buddy Read run by Books with Shae. The other book was White Fragility. I will link below the information about the Blackout Buddy Read as well as the live show that was held pretty recently where Shae and some other booktubers got together to discuss both of the books and also their relationship with BookTube as a community. I highly recommend the live show. I think it was a really interesting discussion. So White Rage is a nonfiction book that takes a look at the history of the US in particular from the Reconstruction period through the modern day and looks at the way that often white people have reacted with rage and with oppression, especially in legislation form, to any sort of progress that is made by the Black community. So I buddy read this with Reija from the book Finch, and it was hard for us to get through this. The Blackout Buddy Read was a 2-week period of reading, and it was a lot to get through in that period because it's just so heavy and so heart-wrenching. This book actually has 5 chapters, so if you're interested in reading it, I suggest maybe spreading it out over 5 weeks with a chapter per week just so that you can read through and process the information. This book really has so much in terms of facts and legislation that it talks about, Supreme Court decisions, laws that were made. It is really stark in the way that it presents so much evidence that shows how the people who have been in power have reacted to every bit of progress that the Black community has made. So just talking about, you know, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which sort of granted all of the rights of citizenship to people who had formerly been enslaved, and then all of the laws that came after that from the Black codes through the Jim Crow era that tried to then erode all of those rights, or things like Brown versus the Board of Education, which gave, you know, the decision that separate but equal is not a thing, and all of the schools needed to integrate, and then all of the pushback against that and all of the extent to which the schools fought back against integration, even to the extent that some districts just closed all of their schools rather than integrate. I mean, it's just intense. And I think that the key thing about this book is that you know that it's bad, but then you read this book and you realize it's so much worse than you thought it was. So it's definitely a really powerful and important read, but you should go into it knowing that it's going to be dense, it's going to be heavy, and it's going to weigh heavy on you. So I do highly recommend the content in this. Just make sure that you pace yourself when you read it. So I gave this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. I definitely recommend it with those caveats of pacing yourself. And I think that Reija and I will probably do a discussion video of this once we have a chance, but we might need to let it sit and process all of that information a little bit before we get to that. The other book that I finished this week was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This is a book that was a favorite of my cousin Jade at Bedtime Bookworm, who I will link below. So I had been interested in it for quite a while, and then it's also one of the finalists for the BooktubeSFF Awards for the fantasy category. So I really wanted to get to this, and I actually had started it a little while ago, but this week was the perfect week to finish it because it is just such an engrossing, really, really interesting epic fantasy that allowed me some bit of escapism after having read White Rage, which was just so much reality. So this story is just really gorgeous and really lush in the way that it's written and in the world building and in the characters. I think that anybody who loves epic fantasy could get a lot out of this, especially if you're fans of something like The Wheel of Time. I think that this has a lot of similarities in that, where it has a really complex world. You go to many different places in that world. You have multiple point of view perspectives for all sorts of different characters. There's also a lot of complexity in terms of complicated characters who are very flawed, people who have differing views on what is the right path, and a lot of political intrigue, and just really the world building is so fascinating because there's so much uniqueness in terms of how each country is portrayed in this, what their clothing is like, their food, their habits, their culture, their history. All of that is very unique, and there's so much lore in this and so much religion. So religion actually plays a big part in the story, which, while very complicated, so I can't sum up all of it here, is basically the story of two sides of the world, the East and the West, who have very different religious beliefs, where the East worships dragons and they have dragon riders, and the West thinks that dragons are evil and they hunt dragons. So these two sides of the world have very differing views. There's a lot of judgment and persecution that happens of people with differing religions here, but they must come together to fight against a true epic evil. And so it's all about kind of a lot of these political alliances and a lot of political intrigue, working with the other countries, working with people from different places, and trying to kind of come together across all of these differences. This book has a lot of complexity to it, and a lot of really interesting themes are discussed. I think that it does a really good job of examining things like belief systems and things like the heritage that you have, and things like your loyalty, who you're loyal to and how that might shift. It does also just a really good job of having complex characters who make a lot of faulty decisions and have to grow from that. I think that this story is also really interesting because it's very feminist. You have a lot of extremely powerful women, and you have a very nice mixture of women and men in all levels of society, in all positions of power. So it feels like a very gender equal society in terms of how the power structures lie. But I also think that the queerness of the story is really interesting. So whereas I think the world has a lot of gender equality, it does not have queer equality. So queerness is not considered an okay thing there, but you have a lot of queer characters, and their romantic attachments are actually kind of the heart of the story. It's really a lot of what drives the story. And so I liked that. I thought that was a really beautiful thing to read. And there's just so much in here that really is engaging and engrossing and just allows you to kind of sink into this world. I absolutely loved that experience. I did think that there were a couple of things about this book that sort of brought me out of the experience every once in a while. Somewhat small, but just occasionally they would get to me. So, for example, sometimes I think that the way that certain parts of the story played out were a little too convenient. Just something happened that didn't really make sense, but it just moved the story kind of in the way that the plot wanted it to move. And that brought me out of the story a couple times. There were also a couple of deaths that I felt were a little too convenient. It reminded me of the idea of fridging, which is when characters, especially female characters, are abused or killed in order to motivate the main character or in order to move the plot forward, and they're just sort of lacking autonomy. And there's actually a book that I really want to read about this topic called The Refrigerator Monologues by, I think, Catherynne and Valente. So I really want to read that, but I felt that in this story a couple of times, and that was a little frustrating. Also, there were a couple of instances where there were some villains who had like villain monologues. So there were just a couple of instances that I felt were a little heavy-handed or a little too convenient, but they were minor, and overall the whole story was just so gripping, and I really just loved sinking into this. It's kind of a long story, a bit over 800 pages, but I just was thoroughly engaged in it. I have heard that, you know, some people find it's a little overwhelming, just the number of characters and names and countries and cultures and everything like that. So if you prefer kind of the more zoomed in type of fantasy where you're getting it from first person and you're with that person the whole time and you're seeing it from their perspective, this may not be your style. But if you like the kind of bigger, lots of point of views, lots of different cultures, lots of different parts of the world, that sort of thing, this book probably will work for you and I'd recommend it. So I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I am so glad that I got this read this week. So in addition to the 2 books that I finished this week, I did also pause one book, which was Idlewild by Jude Sierra. So this is a book that I'd heard about from Yvette at BookCave and Priscilla at Bookie Charm, both of whom I will link below. And I'd been really interested in reading it, especially because it's a male-male romance, and romances are just something that are great when life is stressful. I was actually really enjoying this. I got to about 33%, and then my loan expired. And so the ebook had to go back. It's very much a case of the library giveth and the library taketh away when you are too slow. And I was much too slow on this one. So I do want to come back to this book because I was really enjoying it. It is basically a contemporary romance that takes place in Detroit, and it follows a restaurant owner and a waiter at his restaurant, and they are just kind of forming a friendship in the beginning of this. It's a very slow moving, almost literary book. It feels very atmospheric and very slow and very just kind of beautiful in the way that it's written. So I'm really interested in finishing this book. I just had to pause it for now because my loan expired, and also I have a ton of other loans out from the library that I need to get to, so I'm not sure when I'll get back to it, but I was really enjoying it. Okay, so those are all of the books that I read this week. If you've read any of these books, or you have any comments or any recommendations or anything like that, go ahead and leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear from you.